When I first saw the severed cables dangling from my solar array like a nest of dead snakes, I didn't even get angry. I just stared at them, felt the cold morning air settle over the cul-de-sac, and thought, of course she did. Because that was exactly the kind of thing Karen would do, dramatic, self-righteous, and wrapped in the conviction that she was protecting the community. She once filed a complaint because my mailbox wasn't aesthetically aligned with the rest of the street. Now apparently my solar setup, approved, permitted, inspected, was offensive enough to commit felony vandalism over. The HOA president, a retiree named Hank who couldn't organize a bake sale without a parliamentary motion, had called an emergency meeting about my panels last week. Karen led it like she was testifying before Congress. She said the reflection from the panels blinded her while she gardened, that they attracted crows, and that they looked industrial. The board voted 3-2 to review compliance. Translation: she didn't win outright, so she'd take matters into her own hands. Now, on a quiet Tuesday morning, I had the proof glinting in the sun. Cables cut clean, probably with the same pruning shears she used on everyone's nerve. I called the police, because that's what you're supposed to do. Officer Merrill showed up, took one look, and sighed like a man whose day had just gotten longer. "You got enemies?" he asked. "Just one," I said. He nodded, writing "neighbor dispute" in his pad like it was the understatement of the year. "We'll file a report, but unless you got her on camera," he trailed off. I did. A perfect shot from my ring cam. Karen in her wide-brimmed hat, looking both righteous and sneaky, like a church lady turned cat burglar. When I showed him, he chuckled. "Well, that'll do it." He said they'd handle it, which in HOA land means nothing would happen until I pushed. So I thanked him and called my electrician to get the system safe again. He showed up shaking his head. "This is sabotage," he said. "She's lucky she didn't fry herself." I was thinking the same thing. Then he added, half joking, "You want me to wire her sprinklers next?" I laughed, but a seed of an idea took root right there. Karen didn't confront me directly that day. She just stood across the street, pretending to water her azaleas, glancing at me every few seconds like a cat making sure the mouse was watching. When I lifted my phone and pointed it toward her, she turned her back and kept spraying water onto already soaked dirt. Power move, I guess. By evening, I had an email from the HOA demanding I restore neighborhood aesthetics by removing all non-compliant installations. I replied with the police report and camera still. Then, just to twist the knife gently, I CC'd the city's code compliance office and the solar incentive program administrator. Karen loved authority, until it wasn't hers. 2 days later, she escalated. I came home to find an HOA violation notice taped to my door. Unauthorized exterior wiring visible from street. The wiring in question? The temporary safety cap my electrician had installed while waiting for part. She must have been pacing outside, clipboard ready. I removed the notice, scanned it for the record, and pinned it on my bulletin board under a sticky note that read, "Motives for future revenge." The HOA meeting that Friday was pure theater. Karen arrived early, set out cookies, store-bought, obviously, and positioned herself at the head of the table despite not being president. She opened by accusing me of creating electrical hazards and endangering property values. I let her finish, then quietly slid a printed still of her cutting my cables across the table. The room went silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent light overhead. Hank cleared his throat and said, "We'll, table this matter pending legal review." Karen's face went the color of ripe tomatoes. When I walked out, she hissed, "You're making a mistake." I said, "Yeah, I made one letting you near my lawn." That night, she retaliated the way only an HOA zealot can, with paperwork. 6 emails before midnight, noise complaints, trash violations, even a concern that my porch light was too bright. My favorite was the one titled, "Unregistered Vehicle in Driveway," referring to my classic pickup that had antique plates. I didn't reply. I just archived them, labeling the folder Karen's Manifesto. But the real trouble came the next morning. I woke up to find my sprinkler system spurting erratically, puddles forming along the property line. She had tampered with my irrigation timer, probably thinking she could flood my garden as petty revenge. I fixed it easily, but now the game was clear. She wanted a war. And I'm not the type to lose one. I spent the weekend researching electrical load isolators, ground fault relays, and low-voltage signaling circuits. Not to harm anyone, just to make a point. The idea wasn't to shock her into oblivion, just to give her the jolt of accountability she'd been avoiding her whole life. My plan was meticulous, reversible, and perfectly legal, technically. Because her sprinkler line crossed a shared maintenance strip, she'd illegally tapped into the community circuit years ago. If that circuit happened to trip when tampered with, well, that'd be unfortunate. Sunday night, as I tested my newly upgraded power control unit, thunder rumbled in the distance. It felt poetic. I checked my ring feed one more time, set the system to passive monitoring, and went to bed. At 6:14 a.m., my phone buzzed with a ring alert. Karen, in her robe, had turned on her sprinklers. Seconds later, she shrieked, a short, startled yelp, then stumbled backward onto her pristine lawn. No harm done, but plenty of surprise. I watched, equal parts satisfaction and guilt swirling together. She waved her arms, staring at the sputtering sprinklers like they'd betrayed her personally. The water arced beautifully in the sunrise, each jet hissing like a miniature lightning bolt. It was almost cinematic. By noon, she was stomping around, demanding Hank investigate the electrical irregularities in her yard. I pretended concern. You should probably check with an electrician, I said. Might be a grounding issue. She glared at me, suspicion flickering behind her eyes. You did something, she said. I maintain my property, I replied. You should try it sometime. That afternoon, the police returned, same Officer Merrill, looking like he'd drawn the short straw. Ms. Thompson claims her sprinklers shocked her, he said. I shrugged. Maybe karma finally got conductive. He smirked despite himself. You got any idea how that might have happened? None at all, I said. He jotted notes but didn't push. You two need to stop, he muttered. This neighborhood's turning into a sitcom. When he left, I walked to the edge of my driveway and looked across the street. Karen was pacing her lawn, muttering into her phone, probably dictating her next HOA decree. I thought about ending it there. But then she noticed me watching, raised her chin, and mouthed, "This isn't over." That's when I decided, fine, it won't be. Because Karen wasn't just fighting me over panels or sprinklers. She was fighting the idea that someone could live next to her without kneeling to her tiny empire of rules. And me? I'd spent my whole career designing electrical systems that outsmart people who think they control power. If she wanted control, I'd give her an education in how it really works. That night, as the neighborhood quieted and her windows glowed faintly across the street, I sat at my workbench soldering a tiny circuit board no bigger than a matchbox. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was insurance, a way to remind her that power, once mishandled, always finds its way back. The morning after Karen's sprinkler incident, the neighborhood group chat was in chaos. Someone posted, "Anyone else's water pressure weird?" And before long, the thread had spiraled into rumors about electrical surges and government EMPs. Karen, of course, was the loudest voice. "It's that man across from me," she typed, tagging me like I was a wanted criminal. "He has experimental equipment that endangers our community." I didn't respond. I just made coffee, scrolled through her melodramatic messages, and wondered how a person could type so fast with that much indignation. By mid-morning, she'd convinced Hank to hold another, urgent HOA review. I watched her march house to house, clipboard in hand, recruiting allies like she was running a political campaign. I called my friend Nate, a city electrical inspector I'd known since college. He laughed when I told him. "You know, most people just plant hedges and avoid their neighbors," he said. You, apparently, are running an urban warfare simulator. I told him I didn't start it, but I might finish it. He promised to swing by later to accidentally check a few permits, legally, of course. When the HOA meeting began that evening, Karen entered like a general. She'd even printed glossy handouts, photos of my solar panels, screenshots of her injury report, and a list of community damages, which included stress and lower property morale. I sat at the opposite end of the table, calm as a monk. Hank opened with his usual weary tone. "We're here to address concerns about electrical safety." Karen interrupted immediately. "There is no safety. His system electrocuted my property." The room murmured. I leaned forward. "Actually, Karen, your property isn't even compliant. You've been using the shared irrigation circuit illegally since 2018. She blinked, thrown off. "That's absurd." I pulled out a printed city schematic, courtesy of Nate. "See this line? That's the shared maintenance conduit. Your sprinklers run off it. The HOA is technically responsible for that power draw." Hank squinted at the map. "That doesn't look good." Karen's voice went shrill. "He's lying." But the seed was planted. For once, her empire of paperwork was cracking. The next morning, a city truck parked in front of her house. Nate stepped out with his clipboard and official vest. Karen stormed over before he even reached the door. "You can't inspect my property without permission," she snapped. Nate smiled. "Actually, ma'am, the HOA circuit is public maintenance access. You signed the shared easement." Her expression shifted from fury to dawning panic. I watched from my window, sipping coffee. After 20 minutes of pacing and arguing, she finally let him in. An hour later, Nate texted me, "Confirmed illegal tie-in. You're clean." She's toast. I laughed out loud. Not because I wanted her fined, though that would have been poetic, but because she'd finally face actual accountability. But Karen wasn't one to admit defeat quietly. By noon, she'd called an emergency safety protest. She put up handmade signs near the neighborhood entrance reading, "No solar hazards," and "Protect our families." 3 people showed up. Her husband, her dog, and one confused retiree who thought it was a bake sale. That night, someone keyed my pickup. Just one long, deep scratch across the driver's door. I knew it was her, but I didn't have proof. The ring cam hadn't caught the angle. Still, the message was clear. She was escalating from bureaucracy to vandalism again. That's when my patience finally wore thin. I decided to hit her where it hurt most. Not her property, but her ego. Over the next few days, I built something small but brilliant, a dummy smart irrigation controller disguised as a city testing unit. It broadcast harmless Wi-Fi signals labeled HOA_audit_station. Anyone connecting to it would trigger a fake compliance review alert on their screen. It was pure theater, but the kind of thing that would make Karen spiral. I installed it near the maintenance shed beside her house, legally on HOA land, and waited. It took less than 24 hours. Karen texted the group chat again. "The city is monitoring our utilities. Someone is spying on us." I could almost hear her hyperventilating through the exclamation marks. She marched door to door again, demanding signatures for a citizen oversight petition. People started ignoring her. Even Hank stopped answering her calls. You could feel her control slipping, thread by thread. Then, she made a mistake. Late one night, she crept onto my property again, caught perfectly on camera this time, trying to yank the dummy unit's wires. The footage was gold. Bathrobe, flashlight, muttering to herself about exposing corruption. I sent the clip straight to the HOA board with a short note, repeated trespassing. Please advise. Hank's reply came 10 minutes later. We'll schedule a disciplinary hearing. Karen's empire was officially collapsing. But just as I thought I'd won, something unexpected happened. A county inspector showed up at my door the next morning. We received a complaint about illegal electrical modifications, he said. Says you're running unauthorized conductive deterrence. I sighed. She's creative, I'll give her that. He checked everything, found nothing wrong, and left with an amused grin. Tell your neighbor she'd make a great novelist, he said. Karen, however, took my silence as weakness. That evening, she hosted a community awareness dinner in her yard, basically a propaganda picnic. She handed out pamphlets warning of solar contamination and radiation exposure. One neighbor, Mrs. Kim, asked, if solar power's so dangerous, why does the city keep giving rebates for it? Karen sputtered, that's big solar corruption. I nearly choked laughing from across the street. But laughter turned to disbelief when I saw her husband, Greg, out back near my fence that night. He was trying to inspect my panel wiring with a flashlight. I stepped outside, calm as ever. Can I help you, Greg? He froze. Karen said there might be voltage leakage. There is, I said. About 120 volts of trouble if you keep listening to her. He backed away quickly. Sorry, man. She's just intense. For the first time, I felt a little sorry for him. Living with Karen was punishment enough. Still, I needed to make sure she learned something. Not pain, not humiliation, just consequence. So, I called Hank and requested a public board hearing. I offered to present evidence of HOA misconduct. When the date was set, word spread fast. Half the neighborhood showed up out of pure curiosity. Karen arrived with a binder thick enough to stop a bullet, convinced she'd win by volume alone. When it was my turn, I kept it simple. I'm here because I believe in accountability, I said. Then I played the ring footage of her cutting my solar cables, trespassing at night, and tearing up HOA notices. The room fell silent. Karen's expression crumbled into disbelief. Hank sighed heavily. Ms. Thompson, this is serious. She stammered, he provoked me. Hank replied, by installing solar panels? She looked around, seeking allies, but no one met her eyes. Then came the final blow, Nate's inspection report. He'd filed it officially with the city, documenting her illegal irrigation tie-in. I placed a copy on the table. Seems you've been tapping HOA power for years, I said. Hank read it aloud. Violation of Municipal Code 4.27. That's a finable offense. Karen's face went pale. You set me up, she whispered. No, I said. You set yourself up. I just provided better lighting. When the meeting adjourned, she stormed out, slamming the door so hard the blinds rattled. The room erupted in low laughter and murmurs of relief. People actually thanked me afterward. Finally someone stood up to her, one neighbor said. Maybe now we can breathe again. I just smiled. Let's not jinx it. That night, the street felt quieter than it had in months. Even the dogs seemed calmer. I sat on my porch, looking across at her darkened windows, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was over. But Karen wasn't wired to let things go. I could sense it in the stillness, the kind of silence that meant a storm was building. And sure enough, just before midnight, my ring cam pinged again. Karen stood in her yard, barefoot in the dew, staring straight at my house. She didn't move, didn't shout, just watched. Then she turned on her sprinklers one by one, their arcs crossing under the moonlight like taunting signals. It was almost poetic, almost beautiful. Then I saw the faint orange extension cord running from her porch to the sprinkler box, and my stomach sank. She was rewiring again. That's when I realized this wasn't just a neighbor feud anymore. It was a full-scale power war. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of damp soil and ozone. Something was wrong. My outdoor breaker had tripped overnight, and half my solar array was offline. I walked out barefoot across the cool grass, followed the faint hum of current and saw it. The orange extension cord from Karen's porch was snaking across the shared property line again, plugged directly into her sprinkler control box. She'd done it. She'd tied her system back into the grid, illegally, using a line that fed off my neutral return. For a long moment I just stared at it, equal parts disbelief and admiration. takes a special kind of madness to lose a power war and then plug yourself right back into the battlefield. She must have waited until the neighborhood slept, then crept out to rig her setup again like a suburban saboteur. The kicker? She'd even spray-painted the cord green to camouflage it against the grass. If subtlety had a grave, she'd just danced on it. I grabbed my tester, crouched near the connection point, and confirmed my suspicion. She was drawing current, maybe 2 amps steady. Not much, but enough to trigger irregular load readings on my inverter. That explained the overnight shutdown. She was literally leeching from my solar feed. I disconnected the line, careful not to short anything, and rolled up the cable neatly before setting it on her porch with a note that read, "Nice try. Stop stealing power." By noon, the HOA inbox was already on fire. Karen had sent another all-caps manifesto titled Community Emergency, Illegal Electrical Access. The irony was cosmic. She claimed I had tampered with her sprinklers again and demanded immediate suspension of solar privileges. Hank replied, "Please stop emailing everyone." The silence afterward was better than any apology. Still, I knew this wouldn't end quietly. So I called Nate again. "She's backfeeding through my neutral," I told him. He whistled. "That's dangerous. You want me to get code enforcement involved?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to end it right there with a fine and a citation. But another part of me, the tired, petty, deeply human part, wanted her to feel what it's like to live inside the mess she'd made. "Not yet," I said. "I'll handle it." That night, I went into my garage, turned on my workbench light, and started tinkering. I wasn't building a weapon or anything malicious, just a circuit that would cut her power if she tried tapping into mine again. Think of it as an automatic lesson in boundaries. I rigged a current-sensing relay that would trip when foreign draw appeared, routing the circuit through a harmless but unmistakable deterrent, a pulse of low-voltage current through the shared line. Nothing dangerous, just a 12-volt zap, like static shock from a doorknob, but poetic in its delivery. It took hours of soldering, testing, and calibrating. When it finally worked, I labeled it Karen-proof MK.2. I installed it along the shared trench conduit before dawn, while the air was cool and the neighborhood still asleep. The next morning, I poured coffee and waited. At 6:03 a.m., right on cue, her sprinklers hissed to life. Then came the sound, faint but satisfying, a startled yelp followed by the metallic thud of a sprinkler head popping off under sudden pressure. She must have jumped back, because a moment later my ring cam caught her flailing in a burst of water. I didn't laugh. Not immediately. But the timing was flawless. By mid-morning, she was at my doorstep, dripping wet, hair frizzed like she'd wrestled a lightning bolt. "You think this is funny?" she shouted. I leaned against the doorframe, mug in hand. "You keep wiring into my property. That's theft." "You're lying," she barked. "Your system is dangerous. I'm reporting this to Homeland Security." I blinked. Homeland? Yes. Solar terrorism is real. Then she spun on her heel and stomped off, leaving wet footprints down the sidewalk. I couldn't make this up if I tried. 2 hours later, a white SUV rolled into the cul-de-sac, county energy compliance officers. They got out, clipboard in hand, and Karen met them mid-driveway like a proud whistleblower. "He's operating unauthorized equipment," she said, pointing dramatically at my panels. I came out calm and polite. The lead inspector, a woman named Delgado, smiled awkwardly. "Sir, just routine follow-up. We got a call." I gestured toward the array. "Be my guest." After 20 minutes of inspection, she turned to Karen. "Everything here's code-compliant, ma'am. Actually one of the better residential setups I've seen." Karen blinked, speechless. But his panels are reflective." Delgado shrugged. "So's your SUV." The officers left, amused, and I swear I heard one mutter, "Every neighborhood's got one." Karen, though, doubled down. That evening, she knocked on Hank's door demanding an emergency bylaw amendment. She wanted solar restrictions for aesthetic uniformity. Hank told her, "Karen, we can't outlaw sunlight." She shouted something about community sovereignty, and stormed away. I heard the argument from my porch, every word clearer than it should have been in the still evening air. Later that night, I checked my security feed again and noticed something strange. Karen wasn't pacing or snooping. She was sitting in her yard, cross-legged, staring at her sprinklers as if trying to will them to behave. It almost made me feel bad for her. Almost. Then she stood up, marched to the side gate, and started pulling tools from a tote. My pulse quickened. She was about to tamper again. This time, I didn't intervene. I let her finish, let her think she'd fixed whatever imaginary problem existed. When she went back inside, I quietly flipped the isolation relay. At sunrise, her sprinklers sputtered once, then died completely. No water. None. By mid-morning, her precious flower beds looked thirsty. She stomped around, shouting at Greg to check the pipes. I heard him mutter, "Maybe it's karma." Around noon, my phone rang. It was Hank. "Hey, I know you and Karen have tensions," he said, carefully choosing his words, "but she's threatening to sue the HOA for negligence." I laughed softly. "What's the claim this time?" "Electrical harassment," he said flatly. "That's not even a thing. Tell her that." Later that afternoon, a process server showed up with a manila envelope. I opened it expecting nonsense, and got exactly that. Cease and desist from intentional electromagnetic interference. I had to admire her creativity. She'd copied a federal format template and filled it in with handwritten accusations like vibrational sabotage and solar abuse. I framed it for my office wall. The following day, Greg approached me while mowing. He looked tired, like a man negotiating peace on behalf of a losing army. "Look, man," he said over the roar of the mower, "could you maybe tone it down? She's losing it." I raised an eyebrow. "Tone what down? Reality?" He sighed. "You know what I mean." His shoulders slumped. "She's obsessed. She doesn't sleep. Keeps checking her lawn for radiation." I almost felt bad, but then I remembered the cable cuts, the keyed truck, the trespassing. Empathy only goes so far. Still, I told him, if she stops interfering with my property, I'll leave her alone. Deal? He nodded gratefully. Deal. For a brief, glorious week, peace returned. No emails, no yelling, no sabotage. Even the neighborhood group chat went quiet. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd accepted defeat. Then Sunday morning arrived, and with it the shriek. I ran outside to find Karen in her bathrobe again, pointing at her lawn like it was haunted. Every single sprinkler head was spewing brown, muddy water. She screamed about toxic runoff and sabotage. But when Hank and a few neighbors gathered to see, the truth was obvious. Her own pump had seized from months of unmaintained filters. She'd broken her own system trying to upgrade it with random YouTube advice. She turned on me immediately. "You did this. You poisoned my irrigation." I crossed my arms. "You might want to check your wiring, Karen." Again. "You'll pay for this," she shouted. "I'll take it to the state." She stormed inside, slamming her door so hard the porch light flickered. I thought that was the end of it, until Greg came out 10 minutes later, pale and uneasy. "She's calling a reporter," he said. "From Channel 8. That stopped me cold. If she went public, this could turn from neighborhood drama to viral circus. And in HOA land, reputation mattered more than any fine or repair bill. I realized then that I wasn't just defending my property anymore. I was defending my sanity. And if she wanted to drag this into the public eye, I'd make sure the light that hit her was blinding. Because the thing about power, electrical or otherwise, is that once you learn how it flows, you can direct it anywhere, even right back at the person trying to take it from you. The morning Channel 8 called, I felt that peculiar twinge you get when your private life is about to be televised. They wanted both sides at 11. I rehearsed words, calm, factual, slightly wry, and tried to imagine my face under lights. Karen prepared differently. She dyed her hair a shade of indignation and wore a necklace like armor. When the crew pulled up, neighbors peered from porches, the cul-de-sac suddenly staged for a small, local drama. Karen greeted the camera like a monarch and unfurled a soggy stack of complaints. "Rogue experiments," she said, "danger to the community." The reporter asked for specifics. She waved the notebook as if it were evidence that proved everything. The cameraman lingered on my panels, then cut back to her, capturing the tremor when she mentioned children. People see that and choose a side. When the mic turned my way, I didn't perform outrage. I told a short, orderly truth. The cables, the footage, the city inspector's findings. I played the ring clips with timestamps, let the camera see her on the feed cutting the wires. Nate, the city inspector, agreed to speak and explained what illegal tie-ins do to shared circuits in plain language. That tone reads better on air than fury. The segment ran that evening and the internet did what it does best. Sprinklergate gathered shares. Mrs. Kim left a lemon cake on my porch with a post-it. Good riddance. It felt petty and satisfying. Then legal papers arrived. Her lawyer filed for a temporary restraining order alleging harassment and intentional interference with utilities. For a moment the world inverted. The person who had cut cables and trespassed painted herself the victim. The judge issued an order preventing direct contact while a hearing was scheduled. Suddenly every text and clip was evidence to preserve, not ammunition to fire off in the group chat. I hired an attorney because when neighbors drag you into court you go professional. My lawyer was pragmatic and fond of checklists. "Preserve everything," she said, and I did. We cataloged messages, timestamps, emails, and witness note. Legal framing turns melodrama into filing numbers, and that fungal, bureaucratic order felt oddly comforting. Karen didn't relent. She photocopied brochures about solar hazards, rallied a small civic group, and staged a community meeting where she made her case with the conviction of someone who believes grievance can become fact by repetition. People who had never said hello now asked me questions in my yard. I answered, showed permits, and invited skeptics to inspect the public record. A few took me up and left less convinced of her claims. Then Greg came to the gate one evening, gate heavy. He told me what the polite gossip had suggested. Karen was unraveling. Panic attacks, ravings in the night, lists in a disordered hand. He had been paying fines, rewriting apologies, and living inside someone else's crusade until there was no company left. "I can't do this anymore," he said, voice small and final. He packed his truck that weekend and left. The street noticed, and suddenly the story stopped being about panels and sprinklers and started being about the human cost of escalation. In court the story narrowed to what could be proven. We played the ring montage. Nate testified about illegal tie-ins. Hank testified about repeated complaints. The judge watched, then asked a quietly surgical question about patterns and intent. After 2 hearings, she denied the temporary restraining order and intimated that the municipal violations and trespass could form a basis for enforcement. It was a legal win, but the victory felt like a bandage over a slow bruise. I still had the keyed pickup scar and a city ticket to file. Media attention left traces. Neighbors had opinions now, and opinions stick. I spent long afternoons compiling documentation and answering calls. The adrenaline of confrontation faded into a different tiredness, the steady work of undoing what spectacle had undone. Late one night a text arrived from an unknown number. "She's not done." I thought of reactivating the deterrent, that little device that had discouraged her illegal connections, but I'd built it as a safety nudge, not a weaponized habit. It had kept her from hurting herself and bought time to collect proof, but it was also a thing that could have crossed a line I refused to cross. I unplugged it and tucked the gadget into the back of a closet. Choosing restraint felt heavier and softer than any small triumph. Karen's tactics grew theatrical. A young man in a fluorescent vest parked across the street and photographed my comings and goings, Typed notices appeared in mailboxes about community safety. She staged an all-day vigil with a placard that read "Protect our children from solar." The private security gig folded after a week. Mediation became the practical next move. My lawyer shrugged and recommended it. Court would settle liability, mediation helps neighbors live side by side. In a neutral room, a mediator asked each of us what we would realistically want for the block. The question was mundane and therefore, mercifully, useful. Karen said she wanted safety, and for the first time she sounded less like an antagonist and more like a person with an ache. I said I wanted to fix my panels without fearing midnight intrusions and to mow my lawn without summoning counsel. The mediator proposed inspections, a shared contact for grievances, and an agreement to avoid surveillance tactic. It sounded pedestrian and therefore possible. Mediation didn't erase all damage. There were fines to negotiate and a stack of irritated neighbors to mollify. But it established procedures. People who had cheered from digital sidelines began showing up with practical help. An electrician offering a discounted safety check, a gardener volunteering to prune hedges so complaints about aesthetics lost traction. Greg drove past one afternoon with a rented truck and a nod that needed no cameras. The absence of spectacle was itself a relief. Months passed. The city finished its paperwork. The HOA clarified shared circuit responsibilities. Karen still wrote letters, but they were handled by procedure. Once in a while she would stand at her window and watch the street with that old intensity, but her reach had shortened. The cameras left. The kids who once replayed the news on their phones found new dramas. I kept the device in the closet as a reminder that the temptation to retaliate is a kind of power, and like all power it must be handled. The long lesson was not one of humiliation but of choice. You can measure voltage with a meter, but neighborliness registers in shared cookies and watered lawns. On a bright afternoon, Mrs. Kim pointed out a newly planted tree at the entrance of the cul-de-sac. "For everyone," she said. I ran a finger along a tender leaf and thought about necklaces and courtrooms. This truly felt good. The TV story didn't die quickly. For 2 weeks it replayed in smaller stations and online compilations, always with the same clip title. HOA feud over solar power sparks neighborhood showdown. My inbox filled with messages from people who'd survived their own HOA nightmares. Half thanked me for standing up to tyranny. The other half thought I'd gone too far. Karen, naturally, treated it like martyrdom. She leaned into her new role. Her front yard became a kind of stage. Banners about electrical oppression, lawn chairs arranged like pews, a folding table stacked with flyers that mixed half-understood science and pure emotion. Every evening she held awareness meetings, waving at passing cars as if leading a grassroots movement. It would have been funny if it hadn't been happening 20 feet from my driveway. The HOA board tried to intervene, but legally, her yard was her property. Hank sent polite notices about excessive signage, which she interpreted as proof of conspiracy. She printed larger ones. "We are a community," one read, "not a power plant." Another claimed, "Solar is control." It might have fizzled out there, but she found her next spark, literally. One afternoon I came home to find firefighters in the street and Karen arguing with them, her sprinkler control box smoking faintly. Apparently, she'd tried another rewiring experiment based on a forum post she'd printed. The post advised bypassing resistors for efficiency. She'd done it, and her GFCI outlet had exploded. The firefighters put it out fast, but the damage was done. The smell of burned plastic and ozone drifted across both lawns. She blamed me, of course. Claimed my solar interference had caused the malfunction. The fire chief, trying not to laugh, explained that her setup violated every code in the book. She shouted, "This neighborhood is under siege," as he drove away. That evening, Hank called. "Look," he said, "the board wants to mediate again. People are scared she's going to set something on fire." I said, "I'm happy to meet, but only if she brings a licensed electrician this time." He sighed. You know she'll never do that. Then this isn't mediation, I said. It's containment. The next morning, Karen went quiet. No signs, no shouting. Her blinds stayed closed. For a moment I wondered if she'd finally crashed from exhaustion. Then, late that night, I caught a flicker of motion on my camera. She was out front again, but not yelling this time. She was digging. By the time I walked outside, she'd already buried something along our property line. A small mound of fresh dirt gleamed in the moonlight. I called out, "Lose something?" She froze, shovel in hand. "Boundary markers," she snapped. "You can't move the property line with technology." I stared at her. "Karen, that's not how property works." She pointed the shovel like a sword. "You'll see." The next day, she posted a long screed on Nextdoor titled, "The Truth About HOA Sabotage." It accused me of electromagnetic trespass, radiation poisoning, and psychological warfare using solar reflections. It got 5 comments before moderators removed it. Still, she had clearly crossed from nuisance into obsession. I started documenting everything more carefully: photos, timestamps, GPS logs. My lawyer called it future-proofing. But the more I collected, the stranger things became. Packages started arriving for me. Tools, wires, circuit components I hadn't ordered. My name, my address, my card number nowhere involved. Whoever sent them used gift cards and fake emails. Karen's handwriting appeared on one label, her distinct looped R's, but without direct proof, police couldn't act. I began locking my gate at night. Then, one morning, her yard looked different. Every sign was gone. The lawn trimmed, the sprinkler heads replaced. Her porch, newly painted. Even her SUV washed. It was unsettling, the sudden normalcy. Around noon, she crossed the street carrying a white envelope. "Truce," she said flatly. I didn't trust it, but I took the envelope. Inside was a printed apology form, something she'd found online. It had blanks filled in by hand. "I, Karen Thompson, hereby acknowledge my role in community tension and agree to cooperate for mutual peace." At the bottom, in smaller print, she'd added, "Pending review of solar interference data." I asked, "What's this for?" She smiled tightly. "For the HOA archives. So they know I tried." It was surreal. Still, I signed, added without prejudice, and gave her a copy. She walked away satisfied. That night, the cameras caught her standing in her yard again, staring at my panels. But she didn't yell or dig. Just stared, like someone studying a problem she couldn't solve. Days passed peacefully. Maybe too peacefully. Then came the county inspector, again. He said he'd received an anonymous tip about illegal power storage devices. I laughed. "You mean my backup batteries?" He nodded. "We have to check." It was procedural, no issue, but I knew who'd called. After he left, I sat in my garage, staring at the soft hum of the battery unit. It struck me that every time she struck out publicly, she found a quieter way to needle back. And as much as I hated to admit it, the longer this dragged on, the more I was becoming like her. Checking cameras, saving screenshots, sleeping lightly. Living defensively. She'd turned a technical dispute into psychological warfare, and I'd let her. That night I shut down the cameras, stepped outside without a phone, and stood in the darkness listening to the hum of crickets and distant transformers. For the first time in months, there was no glow from her windows, no movement. Just the night, simple and uncharged. It should have been peaceful. But around midnight, a car rolled into the cul-de-sac. Unfamiliar, lights off. It parked near her driveway. 2 figures stepped out carrying something heavy between them, a generator. They wheeled it into her garage. I snapped a quick photo from the porch. The next morning, her sprinklers were running again, brighter than ever. My meters detected unusual surges on the shared ground line, clean, industrial current. She'd brought in backup power. Probably thought it proved independence. What she didn't realize was that her grounding rod was still connected to the shared HOA strip. She wasn't independent at all. I called Nate to check the safety implications. He said, if she's running a gas generator tied into that line, she's feeding noise back into every circuit on the block. Someone's gonna fry a router. I told him to alert code enforcement quietly. Within hours, a city truck showed up. Karen ran out, shouting about harassment. The inspector ignored her, unplugged the generator, and taped a bright red notice of violation to her door. That should have ended it. But Karen never stopped at should. By evening, she'd taped over the notice with another sign, "Free energy cannot be stopped." Then she disappeared inside. The next day, Hank called again. She's threatening to sue the city now, he said. Claims they're part of a corporate cabal. He sounded exhausted. Can we just install a buffer? Maybe a fence. I almost laughed. You mean between Sanity and the rest of us? Exactly. I agreed to split the cost of a privacy hedge, something green, silent, and hopefully tall enough to block her from view. The landscapers arrived that weekend. As they worked, I saw her peeking through the blinds, scribbling note. When the first sapling went in, she came out yelling, "You can't plant invasive species near my water line." Hank, who'd shown up for good measure, handed her the city permit. She glared, turned on her heel, and slammed her door so hard a bird startled from the gutter. When the work finished, the street looked different, quieter, separated. The hedge stood between our lawns like a green curtain dividing acts of a play. For the first time in months, I couldn't see her house from my window. And the moment I couldn't see her, I stopped thinking about her. That night, I sat on the porch under the faint whir of solar lights, the air still and electric in the best way. I thought about how ridiculous it all was, how a few panels and a petty mind had burned an entire neighborhood's peace. I'd won, technically, but the victory felt hollow, like finally beating a game you never wanted to play. Then, somewhere beyond the hedge, I heard a faint mechanical hum. Not the soft purr of my inverter. Something harsher, sporadic. A whine, a pop, a hiss. I leaned forward, listening. The sound grew louder. Then a sharp flash lit the hedge's edge, followed by a muffled shout. Karen's generator had overloaded again. And in that instant, watching smoke curl faintly into the night sky, I realized it wasn't over. It was never going to be over because people like Karen don't lose. They just look for new ways to rewrite what losing means. The smoke rose in a slow, gray column above the hedge, curling toward the twilight like a signal flare from a sinking ship. I walked to the property line, half expecting sirens again. Instead, I found Karen kneeling in her yard, slapping a towel against a scorched extension cord while muttering something that sounded like prayer mixed with profanity. Her generator sat dark and silent, one side charred black. The smell of melted insulation hung in the air. "Need a hand?" I asked. She whipped around, eyes wild, face streaked with sweat. "You did this," she hissed. "Your system interfered, again." I pointed at the generator. "That's a 240-volt unit, Karen. You plugged it into a 120 circuit. You shorted it yourself." "Liar," she shouted. "You're manipulating current through the ground. I can feel it." I wanted to laugh but didn't. Something in her eyes had changed, less anger, more desperation. It wasn't a performance this time, it was belief. She truly thought I was controlling her power. The next morning, the city inspector returned, same guy, looking even more tired. He held a clipboard like it weighed 40 pounds. "Mr. Davis," he said to me, "we received another report of tampering." "Let me guess," I said. He nodded. "She's saying your solar array emits targeted EMF." I rubbed my temples. "You know it's nonsense." He sighed. "Yeah, but every complaint means a visit. Occupational hazard." He did a cursory check, made small talk, and left me with a half-apologetic smile. Honestly, she needs counseling, not code enforcement. I watched him leave, wondering how far she'd go before someone stopped her. By afternoon, the whole neighborhood had heard. Mrs. Kim texted, "She's outside with a meter again." Sure enough, Karen was pacing her lawn with a cheap EMF detector, waving it like a divining rod, scribbling numbers into a notebook. Every time it beeped near a metal pipe, she'd glare at my house. That evening, Hank called another emergency HOA meeting, not about me this time, but about her. "We can't keep doing this," he said, rubbing his forehead as the group gathered in his garage. "Half the residents have filed noise complaints, the city's threatening fines, and," he glanced at me, "she's convinced you're running a covert operation." "I'm flattered," I said dryly. "Can we evict her from her own property?" "Not legally," he said. "But we can suspend her voting rights and fine her for nuisance conduct." The vote was unanimous. For once, everyone agreed on something. 2 days later, Hank delivered the letter to her personally. I watched from behind the hedge as she read it. At first, she stood still. Then the paper crumpled in her fist. She screamed, not words, just frustration, and stomped back inside. For 3 days, she vanished. Curtains drawn, lights off. The quiet was eerie, almost fragile. Then, on the 4th night, the quiet broke. A deep thunk echoed through the hedge, followed by a metallic scraping sound. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into my yard. The sound repeated, thunk, thunk, then a crackle. I swept the beam over the hedge and froze. Karen was hammering a copper rod into the ground, another grounding attempt, right along the shared line. She saw me and sneered. "You can't own the earth," she said. "I'm grounding out your interference." "Karen," I said carefully, "if you hit the main conduit." She swung the hammer harder. The spark came next, blue-white and vicious. The hammer flew from her hands, the air filled with ozone, and she fell backward into the grass, stunned but alive. I vaulted the hedge, killed the breaker from my control box, and called for help. The paramedics arrived within minutes. She was conscious, babbling about freedom from current manipulation. They loaded her onto a stretcher and drove off, leaving behind a scorch mark on the lawn and the metallic tang of near disaster. That night, the cul-de-sac was silent except for the faint hum of my solar batteries. I sat on the porch thinking about everything, the lawsuits, the shouting, the absurdity, and felt something new creeping in, pity. The next morning, Greg's truck returned. He looked pale and grim. "She's okay," he said. "Minor burns. But she's different. Quiet. The doctors are recommending observation." I nodded slowly. "She needs it." He looked down. "She asked me to give you this." He handed me an envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No rant, no accusations, just a sentence written in shaky handwriting. "You won because you believe in order." I believed in control. I didn't know what to do with that. I folded it carefully, placed it in my desk drawer, and tried not to think about what she meant. The HOA board met again to discuss next step. Hank suggested mandatory electrical inspections for every property to prevent future incidents. No one argued. People wanted closure. They wanted normalcy. When the city crews came to inspect, they found Karen's setup was worse than we thought. Multiple illegal junctions, spliced lines, bare wires running under the soil. The inspector said, "It's a miracle no one died." They dismantled everything, generator, wires, rods, and sealed the trench. For the first time since this all began, my inverter's readout was steady. No surges, no irregular grounding, just quiet efficiency. Weeks passed. The story died online, replaced by new absurdities. Karen's house stayed empty. Greg told us she was with her sister upstate. The hedge grew tall and dense, hiding the scar where her grounding rod had burned the grass. Slowly, life returned to normal rhythms: mowing, mail, morning walk. But sometimes, late at night, I'd see the faint glow of lights flickering inside her windows. Maybe Greg returning to check the place. Maybe just timers she'd forgotten to disable. Either way, the shadows reminded me that peace is never permanent, it's just the space between battles. One evening, I got a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm, almost eerily so. "You fixed the power, didn't you?" I froze. "Karen." I'm not calling to fight, she said. I just wanted you to know, I understand now. Understand what? That energy moves where it's allowed, she said softly. I tried to control it. You learned to respect it. Before I could respond, she hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time. Maybe it was closure. Maybe it was the calm before another storm. A week later, Greg sold the house. A young couple moved in, quiet, friendly, blissfully unaware of the history. They installed new sod, painted the fence, even added string lights across the porch. The night they turned them on, I found myself smiling. The lights glowed warm and steady, no flicker, no interference. For the first time in months, power flowed without tension. Still, part of me wondered if she was watching somewhere. Maybe from her sister's porch, maybe from a rehab center, maybe from the quiet distance where obsession finally burns itself out. People like Karen don't really disappear. They just move their fight somewhere new. Sometimes, I walk past that hedge and think about all the energy, literal and emotional, we poured into this ridiculous war. It started with sunlight and ended with smoke. It cost me peace, but it taught me something about control. You never win it by fighting harder. You win it by walking away. One afternoon, as I checked my panels, the new neighbor, a woman named Ella, waved. "Hey, you're the solar guy, right?" I laughed. "Used to be infamous for it." She smiled. "We're thinking about installing some. Any advice?" I looked at the gleaming panels reflecting the late sun, then at her untouched lawn. "Yeah," I said. "Get permits, document everything, and don't join the HOA board." She laughed. "Good to know." That night, as dusk settled, my inverter's display showed a perfect flow, clean current, zero disruption. The hum was low and steady, almost like a heartbeat. I leaned back in my chair, eyes closed, listening. Across the hedge, the house was dark again. But in my mind, I could still hear her voice, sharp and stubborn. "You can't own the earth." Maybe she was right, in her own twisted way. You can't own it, but you can respect it. And if you're lucky, you can live next to it without someone trying to rewire the ground beneath your feet. For the first time since the cables were cut, I let myself feel something close to forgiveness. Not because she deserved it, but because I needed it. Holding on to anger is just another kind of circuit, feeding itself endlessly. Breaking it is the only way to stop the current. The hedge rustled gently in the wind, and the lights along the porch flickered gold across the grass. Peace wasn't permanent, but for now it was mine. Peace, it turned out, was fragile. 3 months after Karen's house sold, the neighborhood began to forget. New people moved in, the hedge grew thick, and the story became a whispered legend, something told at block parties when the beer was cheap and the laughter too easy. "Remember that crazy solar war?" they'd say, half joking, half curious. I laughed with them, pretending it was ancient history. But one afternoon, while cleaning the garage, I found the envelope again, the one with Karen's final note. The paper had yellowed slightly, the handwriting still jittery. "You won because you believe in order." I believed in control. I turned it over, and for the first time noticed faint indentations on the back, like she'd pressed too hard when writing. Out of idle curiosity, I shaded it with a pencil. The hidden words read, "The current always finds a path." I don't know why, but that line unsettled me. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, the power flickered. Just once, a brief pulse that dimmed the lights and reset the clock on my microwave. It wasn't much, but after months of quiet stability, it felt like déjà vu. I checked the inverter, all readings normal. The grid had probably blipped. Still, a twinge of unease lingered. 2 days later, the new couple next door, Ella and her husband, Chris, invited me over for a barbecue. They were genuinely kind people, the kind you hope move in after a storm. As we grilled and talked, Chris mentioned something offhand. "We had an electrician out yesterday. Said the previous owner did some weird grounding work. Copper rods everywhere. One was fused solid into the soil." I froze mid-bite. "Did he say where?" "Along the back fence," he said. We pulled one up. Thing was welded to an old conduit. He said it might have been for a generator, but the setup made no sense. I smiled faintly to hide the unease. Yeah, she was creative. That night, when the neighborhood went quiet, I walked to the edge of my yard with a flashlight. The hedge had grown thick, but I found the faint outline of where her rod used to be, blackened soil, a shallow depression. The flashlight beam caught a glint of metal deeper down. I crouched, brushed the dirt aside, and there it was, a second rod, shorter, cleaner, untouched by the city crew. She'd hidden one. I almost laughed. Of course she had. Even after everything, she'd left a piece of herself buried between us. I pulled the rod free. It came loose with a soft hiss of disturbed soil. For a second, the air smelled faintly of ozone. Then it was gone. I tossed the rod into the scrap bin in my garage and went to bed. But sometime past midnight, my solar control app buzzed. External fluctuation detected. I sat up, checked the monitor. Nothing major, just a brief voltage spike from the ground input. Probably residual interference, I told myself. Still, I shut down the backup circuit for the night. The next morning, Ella was at my door, holding a burnt-out power strip. Weird question, she said. Do power surges happen here often? Not usually. Why? Something popped in our garage last night. We thought it was the fridge, but everything else is fine. I checked my logs again. Same timestamp. 2:14 a.m. Could be leftover wiring, I said carefully. Want me to take a look? She nodded gratefully. When I stepped into their garage, I saw the culprit immediately. A thin copper wire, half buried near the corner, running along the concrete edge toward the wall. I followed it outside and found where it disappeared into the soil, right where Karen's second rod had been. Some part of her old wiring still connected to the shared line. I clipped it, coiled it neatly, and sealed the spot. All fixed, I said. But that night I couldn't sleep. The words on her note echoed in my head. The current always finds a path. Over the next week, little things began happening. My porch light flickered randomly. My inverter displayed phantom draws that vanished when I checked the panel. My neighbor's security cameras reset themselves twice. Coincidences, maybe. But after living through months of paranoia, you stop believing in coincidences. One evening, while watching the sunset, I noticed Ella standing by the hedge, staring at her lawn. You hear that? She asked. I listened. There was a faint hum, barely audible, like distant static. She tilted her head. It's been doing that all week. Chris says it's nothing, but it's weird. I smiled faintly. Could be residual charge in the soil. Sometimes after storms, it happens. But we hadn't had rain in a month. That night, I powered everything down again. Solar backup inverter. Total isolation. Yet the hum continued. It wasn't electrical, it was psychological. Like the ghost of current still running through the neighborhood, long after its source was gone. The next morning, I decided to dig up the rest of the conduit line near the hedge, just to make sure nothing remained. I unearthed sections of rusted pipe, melted plastic, and, buried deeper, a small metal junction box. It wasn't part of the HOA system. It wasn't city-issued. Inside, nestled among old connectors, was a small device I didn't recognize, roughly the size of a deck of cards, corroded but intact. It looked custom-built. I cleaned it carefully and brought it inside. The casing was stamped with faint initials, KT. Karen Thompson. It wasn't dangerous, no live wires, but inside was a tiny transmitter, long dead, its battery corroded to dust. She must have built it herself, convinced she could measure interference. Her final creation, buried like a relic between our homes. I should have thrown it out. Instead, I set it on my workbench and stared at it for a long time. There was something tragically poetic about it, a woman so desperate for control that she buried her fear in the earth, trying to ground the world itself. That night, I left it on the porch. The wind picked up, rustling the hedge. The neighborhood lights blinked steady, peaceful, unaware of the history humming beneath their lawns. In the morning, the device was gone. Maybe a raccoon took it. Maybe I misplaced it in half-sleep. Maybe Greg came back quietly for closure. I'll never know. But the hum stopped that day. Months passed. The HOA held elections. I didn't run. Ella did, and under her, meetings actually ended early. The rules softened, the fines stopped. The community healed. Every so often, I drive past the county hospital upstate. A voice inside me wonders if Karen's still there, pacing sterile hallways, warning orderlies about energy flow. I like to imagine she found peace. Maybe tending plants in sunlight, finally letting go of the need to own it. One last envelope came in the mail, forwarded from my old P.O. box. No return address. Inside was a photo, an empty field under open sky, no houses, no wires. On the back, written in careful script, "It's quiet here." I smiled. Maybe she had found her path after all. Back home, I stood on my porch as the sun dropped below the ridge. The panels caught the last light, gleaming like armor that no longer needed to defend anything. The hedge rippled gently, no tension behind it now, just air and the faint chirp of crickets. For the first time since she cut my cables, the world felt balanced. Power flowed where it should. Sometimes I still catch the faint scent of ozone on warm days and think of her, barefoot in the dew, chasing control through the soil. I think about how close we both came to ruining everything just to prove a point. The moral wasn't about revenge or triumph. It was about the current itself, the invisible thread connecting all of us. You can reroute it, resist it, or bury it, but it never disappears. It finds its way home. That night, as the street lights flickered on, I walked out to the hedge one last time. I placed a small metal tag on one of the saplings, engraved with 2 words, "Stay grounded." And for the first time in a very long time, I meant it.